The smell hit the rescue workers first, sweet and rotten, like spoiled meat mixed with copper pennies, seeping through the cracks of barricaded doors. It was March 12, 1887, and the blizzard that had trapped Coldwater State Asylum for 4 months was finally breaking. When the first relief team from Helena forced open the main entrance, they found something that would haunt Montana's history forever. Bodies stacked against the door from the inside, fingers worn to bone from scratching at the wood. But these weren't victims trying to escape. They were the ones who had won, the ones who had eaten. Dr. William Hartley, leading the rescue team, would later write in his journal that what they discovered in Coldwater defied every law of God and man. In the main hall, 12 survivors huddled around a fire built from medical records and furniture, their faces gaunt, but their eyes sharp with a terrible alertness. They didn't speak when the rescuers entered. They just watched, the way wolves watch when you stumble into their territory. One woman, still wearing the remnants of a nurse's uniform, held what appeared to be a human femur, gnawing at it absently like a child with a candy stick. She looked up at Dr. Hartley and smiled, her teeth stained dark red, and asked in a voice hoarse from screaming or silence, "Have you brought more food?" The official report would claim that 188 patients and 23 staff members died during what became known as the Coldwater Winter. But the truth was far more complex and infinitely more disturbing, because what happened at Coldwater wasn't just about starvation, it was about choices, about the thin line between civilization and savagery, about how quickly humans can transform into something else entirely when the rules no longer apply. And most disturbing of all, it was about how some of them didn't want to be rescued at all. To understand how 200 souls descended into hell, we need to go back to 1882, when Coldwater State Asylum was considered the crown jewel of Montana's mental health system. Built on 400 acres of isolated prairie land, 40 miles from the nearest town, it was designed to be completely self-sufficient. The isolation was intentional. Dr. Marcus Whitmore, the asylum's first superintendent, believed that removing the mentally ill from society was the first step toward their cure. What he didn't consider was what would happen if society couldn't reach them when they needed it most. The asylum was a small city unto itself. It had its own farm, dairy, slaughterhouse, water tower, and even a cemetery. The main building was 4 stories of red brick and iron, designed to house 150 patients in relative comfort. By 1886, it held nearly 300. The overflow slept in hallways, closets, and eventually, the basement morgue. Dr. Whitmore had been replaced by Dr. James Morton, a man who saw the overcrowding not as a problem, but as an opportunity. More patients meant more funding from the state. More funding meant more prestige, and prestige was the only currency Dr. Morton truly valued. Morton was a peculiar man, even by the standards of 1880s alienists. He stood 6 feet 4 inches tall, with hands that patients described as cold even through gloves. He had trained in Philadelphia under Dr. Benjamin Rush's disciples, men who still believed that mental illness could be beaten out of a patient through enough pain and terror. But Morton had evolved beyond even their methods. He believed that madness was contagious, that it spread through weakness of will, and that the only cure was absolute control. His treatments included ice baths that lasted hours, restraints that left patients hanging from ceiling hooks for days, and a special room he called the quiet box, where troublesome patients were sealed in complete darkness and silence until they begged for his mercy. The staff at Coldwater were carefully chosen by Morton himself. He preferred men and women with their own dark histories, people who wouldn't question his methods because they had nowhere else to go. Thomas Brennan, the head orderly, had been dismissed from 3 previous hospitals for excessive force. Margaret Shaw, the head nurse, had lost her medical license in Chicago for performing unauthorized surgeries. These were people who understood that cold water was their last chance, and they would do anything to keep their positions. The patients were society's discarded souls. Mary Catherine Wells admitted for hysteria after she claimed her husband was poisoning her. She had been right, but no one believed a woman over a respected banker. Jonas Henriksen, a Norwegian immigrant whose inability to speak English was diagnosed as dementia. Sarah Dove, a 15-year-old Blackfoot girl, taken from her family because her traditional prayers were considered signs of possession. William Tanner, a former professor whose theories about electricity and human consciousness had been deemed too radical, too dangerous. Each had a story. Each had been someone before cold water consumed them. The winter of 1886 began like any other in northern Montana, snow in October, blizzards by November. The asylum had weathered many winters, and Dr. Morton saw no reason for special concern. The storerooms were stocked with their usual supplies: salt pork, dried beans, flour, and the thin gruel that served as most patients' primary sustenance. What Morton didn't know was that the previous spring's floods had damaged the foundation of the storage building. Water had seeped in during the summer, and much of the food had already begun to rot. His staff knew, but were too frightened to tell him. They assumed new supplies would arrive before the damage was discovered. The first blizzard hit on November 15, 1886. It lasted 3 days and dropped 4 feet of snow. The second came a week later, adding another 3 feet. By December, the drifts were so high they reached the second-floor windows. The telegraph lines went down on December 3rd. The last message sent was Morton's regular weekly report. All satisfactory at Coldwater. Patients responding well to treatment. It would be the last communication from the asylum for 4 months. Inside Coldwater, the first sign of trouble came when the heating system failed. The coal furnace in the basement required constant feeding, and the coal shed was buried under 15 feet of snow. Patients and staff worked together at first, trying to dig tunnels through the drifts, but the snow fell faster than they could clear it. After 2 weeks, Morton made a decision that would seal their fate. He ordered all patients confined to their rooms to preserve heat and reduce food consumption. Only staff would be allowed to move freely. What he didn't realize was that by separating the 300 patients from the 30 staff members, he had created 2 distinct groups. And in nature, when resources become scarce, groups compete. The temperature inside Coldwater dropped to near freezing. Ice formed on the inside of windows, and patients could see their breath in their locked rooms. Those in the basement, where the morgue had been converted to housing, fared the worst. The stone walls radiated cold, and several elderly patients simply never woke up one morning, their bodies frozen to their beds. Morton ordered the corpses stacked in an unused wing, reasoning they would keep until spring. This was his second fatal mistake. He had just established that the dead were resources to be stored, not people to be mourned. By January, the food situation had become critical. The rotten supplies had been discovered, leaving only enough edible food for perhaps 6 weeks at reduced rations. Morton cut patient meals to once a day, a thin soup that was mostly water-flavored with salt. Staff meals were reduced but still substantial. The patients noticed. They always noticed. Through the walls, they could smell bread baking in the staff quarters, meat cooking. Hunger has a way of sharpening the senses, and the 300 souls locked in their rooms could smell every meal they were on eating. It was William Tanner, the former professor, who first suggested the unthinkable. Not directly, of course. He was too clever for that. Instead, he began telling stories through the walls to other patients, his voice carrying through the thin partitions. He spoke of the Donner Party, trapped in the Sierra Nevada mountains 40 years ago. He talked about sailors lost at sea who drew lots to see who would feed the others. He framed it as historical education, but everyone understood what he was really saying. History was full of people who had survived by making impossible choices. Why should they be any different? The first death that wasn't from cold or starvation occurred on January 18th. Thomas Brennan, the brutal orderly, was found at the bottom of the stairs with his neck broken. Morton ruled it an accident, but the patients knew better. Brennan had been the cruelest of the staff, the one who took pleasure in their pain. And he had been carrying a tray of food from the kitchen when he fell. The tray was never found, and several patients on the third floor seemed less gaunt the next day. Morton noticed but said nothing. To acknowledge what had happened would be to admit he was losing control. The social order of Coldwater began to shift. Patients started organizing, communicating through the walls in a code of taps and whispers. Mary Catherine Wells emerged as a leader among the women, her intelligence no longer hidden behind the mask of forced docility. She had been a chemistry teacher before her marriage, and she knew things. How to preserve meat with salt. How to make small fires without smoke. How to sharpen metal into weapons. The madness Morton had tried to beat out of them was replaced by something else, a cold clarity that came from accepting what they had to do to survive. Dr. Morton tried to maintain control through increasingly desperate measures. He had the strongest orderlies armed with clubs and posted at strategic points. But the orderlies were hungry too, and fear makes poor allies. One by one, they began to disappear. Sometimes a body would be found, sometimes not. The patients had learned that the human body, properly processed, could feed several people for days. They had also learned that the basement morgue, with its stone tables and medical tools, made an ideal butcher shop. The hierarchy that emerged was based not on sanity or morality, but on usefulness. Those who could process the meat were valuable. Those who could keep watch were valuable. Those who were too weak, too sick, or too moral were something else entirely. They were resources. Sarah Dove, the young Blackfoot girl, tried to maintain her humanity by refusing to participate. She lasted 2 weeks before disappearing one night. Her knowledge of traditional preservation methods had been noted, and when she wouldn't share willingly, the group decided she could contribute in other ways. By February, Coldwater had split into 3 factions. Morton commanded a shrinking group of staff barricaded in the administrative wing. Mary Catherine led the largest group of patients who had taken control of the main building and basement. And then there was William Tanner's group, the ones who had embraced what they called the New Order. Tanner believed that the situation at Coldwater was not a tragedy, but an opportunity. They were evolution in action, he claimed, the strong consuming the weak, humanity shedding its false morality to reveal its true nature. His followers didn't just eat human flesh. They reveled in it. They held ceremonies, rituals that gave meaning to the madness. The stories the 12 survivors would eventually tell the rescue team were fragmentary, contradictory, and in some cases, physically impossible. But certain details appeared in multiple accounts. The dining hall transformed into a court where the factions would trade members for resources. The value of a person determined by their weight, their health, their potential yield. The medical wing became neutral ground where a surgeon named Dr. Elizabeth Harper, one of the few staff members who maintained any semblance of humanity, would treat injuries from both violence and frostbite in exchange for protection. She kept detailed records in a journal that would later disappear, though some claimed she burned it herself, rather than let the world know what she had witnessed. One survivor, a young man named Frederick Morse, who had been admitted for epilepsy, described a feast held on February 14th, Valentine's Day. Tanner's group had captured 2 of Morton's remaining orderlies and decided to make an event of it. They decorated the dining hall with frozen flowers from the greenhouse and set the tables with the asylum's finest china. Frederick was forced to play piano while the others dined. He said the worst part wasn't the sight of them eating, it was how normal they made it seem, how they laughed and toasted and complimented the preparation, how they had transformed horror into etiquette. Margaret Shaw, the head nurse who had lost her medical license, underwent a transformation that several survivors mentioned. She had initially sided with Morton, but was captured by Mary Catherine's group in late January. Instead of killing her, Mary Catherine offered her a position. Margaret's medical knowledge was invaluable, and she knew the human body better than anyone else at Coldwater. She became the group's head butcher, approaching the task with the same clinical detachment she had once brought to surgery. She developed methods to maximize yield, minimize waste, and preserve meat for longer periods. She created a system so efficient that even Tanner's group traded with Mary Catherine's faction for her processed goods. The weather began to break in early March, but by then, the damage was done. Of the 300 patients and 30 staff members at Coldwater when the blizzards began, only 12 remained alive when the rescue team arrived. Dr. Morton was not among them. He had been found in his office in late February, dead from what appeared to be self-inflicted wounds, though several survivors suggested he had help. His body had been partially consumed, but his head remained untouched, placed on his desk facing the door like a warning or a trophy. The rescue team's arrival created an unexpected problem. The survivors didn't want to leave. They had adapted to their new reality, and the outside world seemed more terrifying than what they had endured. Mary Catherine Wells stood before Dr. Hartley and explained with perfect clarity that they had done what was necessary. That civilization was a luxury for those who had never been truly tested. That the people who died would have died anyway from cold or starvation, and at least this way their deaths had meaning. She asked him with genuine curiosity, what made their actions any different from soldiers in war or explorers in uncharted lands? Survival was survival. The official investigation was brief and conclusive. A tragic accident caused by unprecedented weather and inadequate supplies. The survivors were transferred to other facilities or released to family members, their stories dismissed as delusions brought on by trauma and starvation. The asylum was closed permanently, and within a year, the building was demolished. The state wanted no reminders of what had happened at Coldwater, but the land remembered. Even today, locals say nothing grows quite right on that spot. The soil is too rich, too dark. Animals avoid it, and those who venture there at night claim to hear sounds that might be wind or might be something else entirely. Dr. Hartley, who led the rescue team, never practiced medicine again. He spent his remaining years writing about what he had seen, though no publisher would touch his manuscript. In his final entry, written just before his death in 1893, he posed a question that haunts anyone who learns about Coldwater. We judge them for what they did to survive. But if we're honest, truly honest, how many days of starvation separate any of us from becoming like them? How many missed meals before civilization becomes a costume we can no longer afford to wear? The most disturbing detail emerged years later from the journal of Frederick Morse, the epileptic piano player. He revealed that not all the deaths at Coldwater were from starvation or murder. Some patients, faced with the choice of becoming predator or prey, chose a third option. They walked out into the blizzard and let the cold take them, preferring a clean death to what survival demanded. Frederick wrote that he could see them from his window, dark shapes against the white snow, walking steadily away from the asylum until they disappeared. He envied them their courage, he said, because they had chosen to die as humans rather than live as something else. But there was another detail Frederick shared, one that subsequent historians have tried to verify without success. He claimed that 3 members of Tanner's group escaped before the rescue team arrived. They had seen the weather breaking and knew that discovery was inevitable. So, they gathered what supplies they could, including preserved meat they had carefully prepared, and vanished into the Montana wilderness. Frederick said Tanner left him a message, carved into the wooden frame of the piano. Necessity is the mother of evolution. These 3 were never found, never identified among the dead or survivors. If Frederick's account is true, they integrated back into society, carrying with them the knowledge of what they had done and what they were capable of doing again. The state of Montana sealed all records related to Coldwater in 1890, declaring them too disturbing for public consumption. But fragments survived. Letters from survivors to family members, diary entries from rescue workers, and most tellingly, a recipe book that was found in the ruins of the asylum kitchen years later by a construction crew. The book contained standard institutional recipes for soup, bread, and porridge. But in the margins, someone had added notes in Margaret Shaw's distinctive handwriting. Temperature recommendations, preservation techniques, portion sizes that would feed the maximum number of people from a single source. The construction crew burned the book immediately, but one worker copied down a single line that Margaret had written at the top of one page. Waste nothing. Even conscience is a luxury we can no longer afford. In 1923, a historian named Dr. James Whitfield attempted to write a definitive account of the Coldwater winter. He interviewed the last 3 living survivors and spent months researching in state archives. His conclusion was more disturbing than any Gothic horror story. He argued that what happened at Coldwater wasn't an aberration, but a revelation. That the asylum, in its isolation and desperation, had simply revealed what civilization worked so hard to hide. That humans are apex predators who have convinced themselves they're something more noble. His book was never published. The manuscript was destroyed in a fire that also claimed Dr. Whitfield's life, a fire the authorities ruled accidental, but which started in 3 different places simultaneously. The last known survivor of Coldwater was Mary Catherine Wells. She lived until 1934, spending her final decades as a respected teacher in California under an assumed name. Her students remembered her as brilliant but cold, someone who never ate with others and who had an unsettling way of looking at people as if she was measuring them. When she died, her belongings included a locked trunk that her landlady opened, hoping to find information about next of kin. Instead, she found hundreds of pages of writing, all in Mary Catherine's neat script. They weren't memoirs or confessions, they were plans. Detailed architectural drawings for buildings designed to be completely self-sufficient. Supply lists calculated to sustain specific numbers of people for specific periods. And most disturbing, population management charts that divided people into categories: essential, useful, expendable, and one other category that Mary Catherine had labeled simply provisions. The landlady burned everything, but she kept one page, drawn to its strange beauty despite her horror. It was a map of the United States, with several locations marked with red X's. Beside each mark was a date, ranging from 1890 to 1933. Were these places Mary Catherine had visited, places where other survivors had settled? Or were they something else entirely, a network of those who had learned the lessons of cold water and were waiting for the next catastrophe to put that knowledge to use? We'll never know for certain because in 1935, the landlady's house burned down with her inside it. The fire department said it was an electrical fault, though they couldn't explain why the doors had been barricaded from the outside or why neighbors reported seeing 3 figures leaving the scene, walking calmly into the night as flames consumed the evidence of whatever Mary Catherine Wells had been planning. The official history says that 201 people died at Coldwater State Asylum during the winter of 1886-87. It says they died from cold, starvation, and disease. It says the survivors were victims of an unprecedented natural disaster who did what they had to do to survive. But the truth, the real truth, that whispers through the decades since is that Coldwater wasn't about survival. It was about transformation, about what happens when humans stop pretending to be civilized and embrace what they really are. Dr. Morton had believed that madness was contagious. He was right, but not in the way he thought. The madness that infected Coldwater wasn't insanity. It was clarity. The terrible absolute clarity that comes from understanding that all our rules, all our morals, all our pretensions to being above the animals are just stories we tell ourselves when our bellies are full and our homes are warm. Take away the food. Take away the heat. Take away the hope. And we become exactly what we've always been. Hungry things that will do anything to keep living. The 12 survivors of Coldwater didn't talk much about what happened during those 4 months, but they didn't need to. You could see it in their eyes for the rest of their lives. Not trauma, not shame, something else. Recognition. They would look at the people around them, the normal people who had never been tested, and they would see them differently. They would see the meat on their bones, the calories in their flesh, the days of survival they represented. They had learned to do the math that civilization teaches us to forget. How many days a person could feed another person. How many people had to die for others to live. How easy it was to make that choice once you accepted that someone had to make it. William Tanner, if he survived as Frederick claimed, would have been satisfied with how history remembered Coldwater. Not as a tragedy, but as a lesson. He had written extensively before his admission to the asylum about the nature of human evolution, about how crisis revealed truth, about how morality was just a mask that prosperity allowed us to wear. Coldwater had proven him right. When the mask came off, what remained wasn't evil. It was natural. It was honest. It was what we had been all along, hidden beneath centuries of comfortable lies. The land where Coldwater once stood remains empty to this day. The state of Montana owns it, but they've never developed it, never sold it, never even officially acknowledged what happened there. Locals say it's cursed, that nothing grows right, that animals avoid it. But maybe it's not cursed. Maybe it's just honest. Maybe it's the one place in America where the ground remembers what we're capable of, where the soil is rich with the truth of what we really are when the world stops watching and survival becomes the only morality that matters. There are reports, unconfirmed and dismissed by authorities, of groups who make pilgrimages to the Coldwater site. They come at night, during the winter months, when snow covers the ground the way it did in 1886. They stand in circles where the asylum once stood and tell stories. Not ghost stories. Instruction manuals. They call themselves the Children of Coldwater, and they believe that William Tanner's new order wasn't madness, but prophecy. They prepare for the next collapse, the next isolation, the next time when the mask will come off and reveal what we really are. Some say these groups are just urban legends, stories invented to add another layer of horror to an already horrific event. But in 2019, a developer who tried to build on land adjacent to the Coldwater site found something troubling. In a cave on the property, hidden behind recently disturbed rocks, they discovered supplies, modern camping equipment, preserved food, medical supplies, and notebooks filled with her writings that echoed William Tanner's philosophy, updated for the 21st century. The pages included detailed plans for surviving societal collapse, with sections on resource management, population control, and protein acquisition that were too specific, too clinical, too practiced to be theoretical. The authorities investigated but found no evidence of current activity. The supplies were removed, the cave sealed, and the developer abandoned the project after his office burned down in a fire that investigators said showed no signs of arson, but also no clear cause. The developer himself left Montana and refused to speak about what he had found, saying only that some knowledge was too dangerous to possess, that some truths were better left buried under snow and time and forgetting. But forgetting is a luxury, just like morality, just like civilization. And luxuries are the first things we abandon when survival is on the line. The story of Coldwater State Asylum isn't really about the past. It's about the future, about what waits inside all of us for the right circumstances to let it out. About the mathematics of survival that we pretend don't exist until we're forced to solve them. About the recipes written in margins and the maps marked with red X's and the groups meeting in darkness to prepare for the next time the world forces us to choose between dying as humans or living as something more honest. Dr. Hartley, who led that rescue team in 1887, spent his last years trying to warn people. Not about what had happened at Coldwater, but about what would happen again. He wrote that every institution, every city, every family was just 4 months of isolation away from becoming Coldwater. 4 months without food, without heat, without hope, without the comfortable lies that let us pretend we're different from any other predator. He died, believing that the survivors weren't the lucky ones. The lucky ones were those who walked into the snow and chose the clean death of cold over the dirty business of staying alive. But perhaps the most chilling detail of all is this. Of the 12 survivors found at Coldwater, only 8 were ever officially identified. 4 individuals were processed, treated, and released, but their names appear in no records before or after the event. They had no families looking for them, no histories that could be traced, no futures that could be followed. They simply existed for that moment when the rescue team found them. And then they vanished back into America, carrying with them the knowledge of what they had done and what they had become. Some historians believe these 4 were members of Tanner's inner circle, the ones who had most fully embraced the new order. They had destroyed their own records during the chaos, erasing their identities so they could disappear when rescue came. If this theory is correct, then they didn't just survive Coldwater. They graduated from it. They went out into the world with a secret education in the arithmetic of survival, the chemistry of preservation, and the psychology of making the unthinkable seem necessary. These 4 unnamed survivors would be long dead by now, but their descendants, if they had any, would carry that knowledge forward. Somewhere in America, there might be families who gather for reunions and tell different stories than the rest of us. Stories about ancestors who survived when others didn't, who made the hard choices, who understood that civilization is just a game we play when we can afford to play it. They would recognize each other by subtle signs, shared understanding, a certain way of looking at the world and the people in it. The real horror of cold water isn't what happened in that asylum during the winter of 1886-87. It's that it revealed a truth about human nature that we've spent over a century trying to forget. It showed us that the distance between citizen and cannibal is measured not in morality, but in meals. That every person walking past you on the street, every neighbor, every friend, every family member carries inside them the capacity to make the same choices the people at Coldwater made. They just haven't been hungry enough yet. William Tanner, in his writings before his commitment to cold water, had proposed that human civilization was an evolutionary dead end, that by protecting the weak, feeding the hungry, and healing the sick, we were preventing natural selection from creating a stronger species. He believed that catastrophe was necessary for evolution, that only through crisis could humanity transcend its current limitations. Cold water, in his view, wasn't a disaster. It was a laboratory, a place where nature could reassert itself and show us what we really were beneath the costume of culture. The fact that Tanner's writings were all destroyed after Coldwater, that possession of them was actually made illegal in Montana until 1950, suggests that authorities understood how dangerous his ideas were. Not because they were mad, but because they made too much sense to people who had been hungry, who had been cold, who had been forced to choose between their principles and their survival. His philosophy was a virus that could only infect those who had already been weakened by desperation, but once infected, they could never fully recover. In 1976, a cemetery worker in Helena, Montana, made a disturbing discovery. While moving old graves to make room for development, they found a mass burial site that didn't match any official records. The bodies, over 30 of them, showed signs of systematic processing, knife marks on bones that suggested deliberate butchering. Carbon dating placed the deaths around 1890, just 3 years after Coldwater. The location was 40 miles from the Asylum site, exactly the distance a small group might travel if they were looking to establish a new settlement. The remains were quietly reburied, and the development was canceled. But a local historian named Patricia Graves spent years investigating the site. She found evidence of a small community that had existed briefly in that area, a group of about 40 people who had arrived in 1887 and disappeared by 1891. They had kept to themselves, rarely trading with neighboring towns, and were remembered primarily for their strange customs and their refusal to let outsiders visit their settlement. The few traders who had done business with them reported that they seemed healthy, even prosperous, despite having no visible means of support. They had meat when others were struggling through drought and crop failure. They always had meat. Patricia's research was never published. She claimed that she had destroyed her own notes after having nightmares about what she had discovered. But before she died in 2003, she told her daughter one detail that she couldn't forget. In the settlement's remains, she had found a piano, weathered and broken, with words carved into its wooden frame. Necessity is the mother of evolution. The same message William Tanner had supposedly left for Frederick Morse at Coldwater. The implications are horrifying. If Patricia's discovery was real, it means that some survivors of Coldwater didn't try to forget what they had learned. They tried to recreate it. They established a community based on the principles they had developed during those 4 months of horror, a place where the new order could be practiced without the constraints of conventional morality. And for 4 years, they succeeded. What happened to them in 1891 remains unknown. Perhaps they were discovered and disbanded by authorities. Perhaps they turned on each other when resources became scarce. Or perhaps they simply evolved again, adapting to new circumstances, disappearing into the general population with their terrible knowledge intact. Today, Coldwater is just a name on old maps, A cautionary tale told in Montana history classes. A Wikipedia page that most people skim without really understanding. The official narrative has been sanitized, reduced to a simple story of survival in extreme circumstances. But for those who dig deeper, who read between the lines of survivor accounts and examine the evidence that wasn't destroyed, a different picture emerges. Not of victims and tragedy, but of transformation and revelation, of humans discovering what they really are when the comfortable lies fall away. The asylum's former site is now private property, owned by a trust that no one seems able to trace. The land is fenced, posted with no trespassing signs, and patrolled by security guards who won't say who employs them. Locals report seeing lights there sometimes, especially during winter months. Cars with the out-of-state plates arrive at night and leave before dawn. The security guards turn away curious visitors, but seem to expect certain people who know exactly where to go and what to say. Some believe that Coldwater has become a pilgrimage site for those who understand its true significance, not as a place of horror, but as a place of enlightenment, where the facade of civilization was stripped away to reveal the authentic human animal beneath. They come to stand where the asylum once stood, to touch the ground that absorbed so much truth, to remind themselves of what they are capable of when necessity demands it. The 12 official survivors of Coldwater all died within 20 years of their rescue, most by suicide or under mysterious circumstances. But their stories lived on in whispers, in nightmares, in the careful warnings parents gave children about the dangers of isolation and the importance of staying fed. Because every parent who knew the true story of Coldwater understood that their children carried the same potential, the same capacity to choose survival over morality, the same ability to do the arithmetic that values calories over conscience. Dr. Elizabeth Harper, the surgeon who maintained the medical wing as neutral ground during the faction wars, left behind a single statement before her death in 1889. We tell ourselves that we were driven mad by hunger and cold, but the truth is that we were never sane to begin with. Sanity is just an agreement we make when we're comfortable. Take away the comfort, and you take away the sanity. What remains is what we've always been. Organisms programmed to survive at any cost. Coldwater didn't break us. It fixed us. It returned us to our factory settings. This is perhaps the most terrifying aspect of the Coldwater story. Not that ordinary people became monsters, but that they simply became themselves. That the elaborate moral structures we build, the rules and laws and customs that define civilization, are just collective delusions that evaporate under sufficient pressure. That every ethical principle, every religious commandment, every social contract is contingent on having enough food in our stomachs and warmth in our homes. The winter of 1886-87 was not particularly severe by Montana standards. Other institutions survived similar isolation without descending into cannibalism. This fact has led some researchers to propose a disturbing theory that what happened at Coldwater was not caused by the conditions, but revealed by them. That the asylum, by gathering society's discarded and damaged individuals, had accidentally assembled a group already primed to abandon civilization's constraints. That Mary Catherine Wells, William Tanner, Margaret Shaw, and the others didn't break under pressure. They had been broken long before arriving at Coldwater, and the crisis simply allowed their true natures to emerge. If this theory is correct, then Coldwater becomes even more unsettling, because it suggests that in every city, in every institution, in every gathering of humans, there are those who are already broken in this way, already prepared to make the unthinkable choice, already doing the arithmetic of survival in their heads. They walk among us wearing the mask of civilization, playing by the rules as long as the rules benefit them. But when the storm comes, when the food runs out, when isolation descends, they will remember what they really are. And they will teach the rest of us, whether we want to learn or not. The final mystery of Coldwater concerns Dr. James Morton himself. His body was found seated at his desk, but the survivors' accounts of his death were contradictory and suspicious. Some said he killed himself in despair. Others claimed he was murdered by patients seeking revenge. But Frederick Morse told a different story, one he only shared once and then never repeated. He said that Morton hadn't died at all, that the body at the desk was someone else, dressed in Morton's clothes, positioned to be found, that Morton had made a deal with Tanner's group, trading his medical knowledge and the keys to the supply rooms for safe passage when the weather broke. According to Frederick, Morton escaped Coldwater before the rescue team arrived, carrying with him detailed notes on everything that had happened. Not with horror, but with scientific fascination. He had observed the transformation of his patients and staff with the detachment of a researcher watching rats in a maze. The crisis had been unintentional, but Morton had recognized its value as an experiment in human nature. He had documented who broke first, who adapted fastest, who chose death over participation. He had, in effect, conducted the most extreme psychological study in American history. Frederick claimed that Morton had spoken to him before leaving, telling him that Coldwater was just the beginning, that what they had learned about human nature under extreme conditions would revolutionize the treatment of mental illness, the management of populations, the very structure of society itself, that the weak could be identified and removed, the strong could be cultivated, and humanity could be deliberately evolved through controlled crisis. Morton saw himself not as a failure, but as a pioneer, someone who had stumbled upon a terrible but necessary truth about what humans really were and what they could become. If Frederick's account is true, then somewhere in America, Dr. James Morton lived out his days under an assumed name, carrying with him the data from humanity's darkest experiment. His notes, if they exist, would be a blueprint for transforming civilization, for using crisis as a tool of evolution, for turning every institution into a potential cold water. The thought that such knowledge might exist, might be studied, might be applied, is perhaps more terrifying than anything that actually happened in that asylum.